Well, thanks very much for inviting me back. I should say, David, in one respect, David Cameron is ahead of you. He's already read The Plundered Planet. I know, because he got wind of it about 3 months ago, and he sent me a message saying, please, can I have an advance copy? So I was rather impressed by that. He'd got other things to do at the time. And he certainly has now. I think The Plundered Planet is the most important book that I've written because it's focused on something that's hugely important both globally and especially for the poorest countries, and it's focused agenda. It's a practical agenda. It's trying to reconcile nature with prosperity. That's the subtitle. And it will therefore offend two groups. It's trying not to offend. It's trying to build a big common ground between environmentalists and economists. But it will offend the unreconcilable at each wing. Right? It will offend what I think of as the fundamentalist and romantic environmentalists. Right? Prince Charles will not like this book, right? For sure. And it will offend all the ostriches who in denial that there's a problem. Right? Nature is valuable and it's vulnerable and it's being mismanaged. It's also by far the most important asset and opportunity for the poorest countries on earth. So that's why it matters. Now, let me take an insight from environmentalism and an insight from economics and put them together. And come up with some practical ethics of the natural world. Natural assets and natural liabilities, because they're natural, have no natural owners. Right? The normal way of getting ownership of an asset is somebody makes it. Right? Nature's not like that, it's there. Because there's no natural assignment of property rights, in default of decent governance, those natural assets are subject to plunder. And as an economist, I'm going to give plunder a very precise economic meaning. Plunder can take two forms. One is where the few expropriate what should belong to the many. And as an Africanist, I've seen that again and again. But the other form of plunder, which comes more naturally to the mindset of environmentalists, is where the present generation expropriates what should, by rights, belong to the future. Right? That's a very important insight from environmentalism, our obligations to the future, the rights of the future. But let me look at it from the prism of economics, of an economist. What does plunder of the future mean? And I think the big insight I want to bring from economics is that natural assets are just that. They're valuable assets. And the rights of the future are essentially the rights of ownership, of co-ownership over valuable assets. That doesn't literally mean that those natural assets have themselves to be preserved. What has to be preserved and handed on to the future is value. Either those assets themselves, or if we use those assets up, at least the equivalent value in other assets. And the ethical test we should put ourselves through is the following thought experiment. We should imagine ourselves as those people living in the future, and we should say, given the way you're using natural assets and pumping up natural liabilities in the present, is that okay by us? Right? Now, as we'll see, depending on the context, sometimes the future is very likely to say, don't do that, and sometimes the future is likely to say, yes, use those assets up, use those natural assets up, convert them into other assets that are more valuable. And that answer can only be arrived at pragmatically by looking at the detail of each particular natural asset and what it can be converted into. We cannot be ideological about it. And so the romantic notion that that our role is to be the curators of a set of natural artifacts, which have to be put in a museum and handed on to the future, I think that view is fundamentally antipathetic to the challenge of reducing global poverty. There's a different environmentalism which says we're not curators of a set of natural artifacts, we're custodians of value, of valuable assets. And if we use those assets, it must be to convert them into other assets which we pass on to the future, which are even more valuable, and which the future will regard as more valuable. We are custodians of value, not curators of artifacts. And it's that shift from the romantic to the pragmatic environmentalism which is entirely consistent with the challenge of reducing global poverty. Now, natural assets, because they don't have natural owners, are plundered unless there's good governance. There has to be governance of how these assets are managed. Looking across the world's natural assets, nature is misgoverned very often, but there are two rather different, huge holes in governance. And I'm going to turn to each of them. One is in the societies of the bottom billion. In the societies of the bottom billion, governance is often weak, not always, but often weak, and natural assets loom very much larger in value than they do in our own societies, because those societies have so little else. And so there's this huge value which is stressing already weak governance. And so what has tended to happen has been plunder in one form or another. And the other big hole in governance is the assets, the natural assets and liabilities, which don't have the decency to respect man-made frontiers. And so they're transnational. They're the fish of the oceans, the natural resources beneath the oceans, the natural resources beneath the Arctic and the Antarctic, the atmosphere. Yeah? All these are transnational assets, and we don't have any global governance. In fact, we've got less global governance than we had 20 years ago. And so these are the two big holes in the web of governance of natural assets. That's not to say governance of natural assets is good within our own national domain. It isn't. But in these two, we haven't even got the governance structures in place that could make it good. So I'm going to turn to each of those for a few minutes. I'm going to start with the poorest societies on Earth, the bottom billion. And I'm going to give you a number which I guarantee is the one thing that in a year's time you'll remember from this talk. Right? And we're going to start with the rich countries of the world as a whole group, the OECD. And we're going to take the average square mile of the rich countries, and we're going to look underneath it. Underneath the average square mile of the rich world is about $300,000 worth of subsoil assets, oil, minerals, and what have you. Right? And now we're going to move from the rich world to the poor. In fact, let's be concrete and move to Africa. We're going to do the same thing for Africa. We're going to take the average square mile of Africa and look underneath it, the value of subsoil assets. Now, why you're going to remember this is you're going to tell me. I'm going to give you a choice. $300,000 in the OECD. Africa, could be less, could be more. You tell me. Who thinks that in Africa it's less? And who thinks in Africa it's more? And this is why you're all going to remember it, because you're all wrong. In fact, you're all very wrong. The figure for Africa is $60,000. Now, why? This is, if you think, the more you think about it, the more you think, this is really unlikely. I mean, the rich countries of the world are a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Pretty random quarter of the Earth's land surface. Africa's almost as big. So we're taking 2 quadrants of the Earth's surface, and we find the average is so different. Statistically, it just can't be. Right? Well, let me assure you, statistically it isn't, because I cheated. Right? The figures I gave you were for known subsoil assets. You know, I tried to find the figures for unknown subsoil assets. I just couldn't find them. Right? And so the explanation is, of course, that there's just been an awful lot of less prospecting and discovery in Africa and the other countries of the bottom billion. I could have given you the figures for all the bottom billion. It's the same. Right? Now, this has one huge implication. When you all put your hands up for more, in one sense, you're quite right, that already natural assets loom much larger in the bottom billion than they do anywhere else. Right? Natural assets are pretty well double invested assets in the bottom billion, whereas they're much less than invested assets in our own societies. So they're already the big story. But they're going to become a much bigger story. Because with high global commodity prices, by hook or by crook, over the next decade, those natural assets that are under there, that $240,000 of hidden natural assets, they'll be discovered. So multiply by 5 the scale of resource extraction from Africa that's going on at the moment, and you've got some sense of the scale of what's to come. I said they'd be discovered by hook or by crook, and probably by crook. Right? That's the default option. Now, this is a tidal wave of money that's going to be extracted from these societies. Bigger than, it dwarfs aid, it dwarfs remittances, foreign investment, all the rest of it. This is by far the most important financial flow that Africa will ever have, all the countries of the bottom billion. It's a one-shot game. They're depleting natural assets. They're here, they're gone. Right? So that money has the potential for transformation. This is Africans could be empowered by their own money to transform themselves from poverty to prosperity. But if history repeats itself, it will be at best a missed opportunity. So, a major part of the Plundered Planet is to say what has to happen in order for that harnessing to take place. And it goes through the whole decision chain of what matters to a society to actually be able to harness it. And it's a set of decisions. I've not got time to go through them all, but I'll go through a little bit. The first link in the chain, you already know, is broken. It's just you don't know you know. The first link in the chain is discover your natural assets. The fact that so few have been discovered tells us that's broken at the moment. But we'll not worry about that. Let's assume that gets fixed over the next decade. This stuff's going to be found because it's so valuable. The next link in the chain is preventing that first form of plunder, the few expropriating what should belong to the many. The value of natural resource extraction has got to be captured by the society. And that means you've got to sell resource rights in a way that actually gets value to the government. You've got to tax resource extraction in a way that gets value to the government. And at the moment, that link in the chain is drastically broken. Let me give you an example. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, which incidentally is neither democratic nor a republic. It's only recently been called the Congo, actually. But, so, Democratic Republic of the Congo, exports of gold believed to be of the order of $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year. Tax revenues from oil exports flowing into the treasury of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, $37,000. Not much capture there for society. I could give you a string of numbers like that. So that link in the chain is badly broken. It doesn't have to be broken. It's a fixable link. In the book, I propose a lot of ways of fixing that link. Next link in the chain, avoid disastrous situations like the Niger Delta, where the inhabitants of the Delta, their concerns and interests have been neglected for years and years, and in response, they've turned to violence. And that violence has now impeded the resource extraction. At the moment, inhabitants of the Delta have been driven to demand ownership over the oil. And I think that's actually the wrong response. That's not an ethically sound solution. Some romantics like it because they love the idea of local communities being empowered. And so the natural resources should belong to the local community. I don't think that's right. If we go down that road, we end up with natural assets being very unequally held. Because if we look underneath the earth, natural assets are randomly distributed, but they're very bunched. So what we'd have is a few localities with multimillionaires and vast areas with nothing. The best we can do in practical terms is to say the natural resources in a country should belong to all the citizens of that country, present and future. Right? We've no real mechanism for spreading ownership wider than the country, but we certainly shouldn't entertain concentrating ownership more narrowly. Right? It's already bad enough. The little country of Sao Tome and Principe is sitting on top of oil wells. There's only 100,000 people there. Ethiopia, with what, 80 million people, is sitting on top of nothing. Right? They're all Africans, but there's no mechanism for transfer. We can't do anything about that, but believe it or not, in Sao Tome and Principe, it's two little islands, 100,000 people. Guess what? The people live on one island, and the oil's underneath the other island. So the 8,000 people who live on the little island with the oil are saying, oh, we're not citizens of Sao Tome and Principe, this is ours. Right? How greedy can you get? Right? So allowing local to claim ownership rights is a false move. Right? Just because you paddle your kayak several thousand feet above an oil field doesn't mean that you own the oil field. Right? So what are local rights? What's legitimate local rights? It's not ownership. It's to full and generous and credible compensation for any unavoidable costs. And it's for those costs themselves to be minimized. And above that, it's for full and equal participation in the benefits to the nation's citizens. Who should the benefits go to? To the nation's children, because these are assets for the future. So if the natural assets are burned up, assets must be passed on to the future. So we've discovered our assets, we've taxed them, we've compensated the local community so it doesn't explode. The next link in the chain is the decision what to do with the revenue. Do you spend it on consumption or do you save it? Because the revenue is coming from depleting an asset, it's a distinctive sort of revenue. It's not like other assets. And so depleting that asset, you should build up other assets. That's incidentally what we failed to do with North Sea oil in Britain. Right? It was just treated as any old government revenue. We just lived through an oil boom, and we've nothing to show for it in the way of assets. Right? Nigeria did that for years. Between 1970 and 2003, the savings rate out of depleting oil was at the most 10%. So it was all spent on consumption. Reformers came in 2003, and they managed to slam up the savings rate to something over 50%. So by the end of the oil boom, Nigeria had cleared all its debts and accumulated over $70 billion in financial assets. So that was brilliant. And in the years since the reformers left power, that position's been dissipated. So a Nigerian was just telling me yesterday that at the moment, as of 2010, the oil revenue coming into Nigeria just pays for the recurrent expenditure of the government. No coverage for asset accumulation at all. So let's save it. And the final issue is, what do we do with those savings? And the model that's out there for prudence at the moment is Norway. 50 governments of developing countries have asked Norway for advice. And that's, on the one hand, quite encouraging. It shows that they're concerned about saving for the future. But it's also very worrying, because Norway's the wrong model. It's the right model for Norway. What they do, Norway has got more invested capital per worker in Norway than any other society in the world. So if you added capital to those workers in Norway, if you use the oil just to pile on more and more capital, that capital wouldn't be very productive. It makes more sense to invest in capital elsewhere in the world where capital's more scarce. So that's what the Norwegians do. They give their money to those wise New York bankers who then invest it in capital around the world, right? But that strategy would make no sense for a country like Sierra Leone, about as poor as it gets. Virtually no investment for the last 40 years, desperately short of capital. It would be obscene for Sierra Leone to pile up financial assets abroad, claims on other people's, it basically invests its wealth in other people's capital. It needs to invest its oil money and its other natural asset money in Sierra Leone. But the final problem is how to do that. Because one reason these societies have got so little capital invested is that although they're short of capital, they've not mastered the process of investing productively. And so the process of investment is broken. So the final step is to build the capacity to invest well. I call that stage investing in investing. In many ways, it's the hardest stage. There's the chain of decisions, and it is a chain. It's a weakest link problem. If any of those links breaks, you've got a broken chain, it's going to produce plunder. So all the links have got to hold, and what's more, they've got to hold for about a generation, because that's the sort of time scale it takes to pull the society out of poverty to prosperity. So a whole chain of decisions have got to be got right again and again. How? I'm going to park that and move for a few moments to the other great hole in global governance. And then I'll end there with a how and come to a common answer. So we're now going to move from the bottom billion to those natural assets and liabilities that are transnational. Carbon's one. Fish in the oceans are another. And I think I'll talk about fish. I've got a chapter on both carbon and fish in the book, but let me talk about fish, because people don't know much about fish. And fish is such once you know anything about it, it's such a stark problem that it's astounding that we're making so many mistakes. Fish is really simple, much easier than carbon. Global fish industry is not a very big industry. It's about $80 billion a year. Only about 15% of that is in the oceans. And let's focus on the oceans. Of course, until fishing technology advanced, there was no issue, no problem. People could just go out and fish and catch a tuna or whatever, and the rate at which they caught them was enough for the fish to renew. Right? The problem arises because technology has advanced, and so if now everybody just goes and fishes, there'll be no fish. We will plunder the future. Right? Our grandchildren will grow up in a world where there are no ocean fish. Right? That, to my mind, if you go through this thought experiment, can we compensate the future for no fish by saying, well, we'll leave you a lot of man-made assets. You can have a lot more video games. We'll convert the tuna into video games. You can have video games. What's the future going to say? They're going to say, we've got a lot of those anyway. All right? We'd rather have the fish. All right? So that thought experiment, see, if you do that thought experiment in the countries of the bottom billion and the chain holds, those future generations are going to say, for goodness sake, harness those natural assets to get us out of poverty. We don't want to stay poor. Huh? So in the bottom billion, as long as the decision chain holds, the right answer is going to be use up the natural assets. But when it comes to things like tuna or carbon, that thought experiment is going to give the opposite answer. It's going to say preserve the natural assets. So, back to fish. If we restricted fishing of the ocean fish to a level at which fishing would be sustainable, those fish would be very valuable. In economic terms, they'd have what's called a rent as part of their value. Easiest way to think of rent is to think of a barrel of oil. It costs about $7 to get a barrel of oil out of the ground. Capital cost, labor, risk, and all the rest of it. Once you've got it out of the ground, it's worth about $80. So $73 of the $80 is rent. It's not a return on doing anything. It's the intrinsic value of the natural asset. Yeah? Tuna, if we restricted the catch properly, would also have a rent on it. Yeah? Quite a big rent. And then the question is, who should get that rent? There's no more reason for fishermen to get that rent than there is for oil companies to get the rent on oil. Oil companies don't get the rent on oil. In a proper system, that oil rent is taxed. That accrues to the society. It's the same with tuna. Why on earth should fishermen, who will be compensated for the cost of capital, the cost of labor, the risk, and all the work, and then there's the rent left, why should fishermen get it? So who should get it? Well, at the moment, to the extent that we do any fishing regulation, we give those rights away. In fact, we give them to fishing lobbies. Yeah? So we're just giving away an asset. We're not regulating enough, so the fishing rights are not as valuable as they should be because we should be restricting more. Yeah? But those fishing rights the value should really accrue to citizens of the world. These tuna don't have any particular national passport. They don't live in any national waters. And so they should accrue to everybody. I've estimated that the rents on fish probably of the order of $20 billion if we ran the fishing industry right. So in an ideal world, the fishing industry will be writing us a check for $20 billion a year for the rents that it's extracting. Do you know what's happening instead? Instead of us getting a check from the fishing industry of $20 billion, we're giving it a check of $30 billion each year. The subsidy on fishing is $30 billion a year globally. What does the fishing industry do with that $30 billion? It plunders fish, so there won't be any left. Right? So there's a net cost to global citizens of something of the order of $50 billion, but having spent that money, we're still not tackling the problem of fish. We're going to run out of fish. And then it gets worse than that, because who is this $50 billion benefiting? It's not even, in the end, benefiting fishermen, because what they do with it is they expand the fleet too much. So to compete for catching the fish, they have a vastly excessive fishing fleet. There's estimates that the world fishing fleet is something like double what is needed to catch the fish. So the rents are being dissipated in inefficiency. So it doesn't get worse than fish. Right? And yet we've not managed to come up with global governance to manage the fishing industry. We're so far away from efficient and equitable management. In the book, I propose a simple solution for fish, which is we introduce a global tax on fish. The right point of control of ocean fish is probably not, I think, the fishing boats where they're caught out in the ocean. It's very hard to observe those fishing boats. The ocean's very big. The right point to observe the fishing industry is at the point where those fish are priced, which is wholesale markets. At that point, we should tax. And who should get the benefits from that tax? I suggest it should fund the United Nations World Food Programme, which is drastically underfunded and could do with the money. Simple. So, a problem in the bottom billion, a global problem, how to solve them. 10, 20 years ago, we'd have said solve them by leadership. Good leaders in the bottom billion, and for the global issues, put our leaders together in a conference hall. Well, you know what? We tried that, and it doesn't work, does it, David? All right, you've seen Copenhagen. It doesn't work in any dimension at the moment, international cooperation. If you look at trade, the Doha round's collapsed. Right? So the capacity for international cooperation is just not there anymore. Our leaders keep on belligerently taking up petty nationalistic agendas, trying to posture how well they're defending the natural interest, sacrificing the global interest. So what's the solution, both to the challenge of the bottom billion, how to avoid plunder in their societies, and to the challenge of global public goods of managing nature? The solution, there's no alternative but to building, society by society, a critical mass of informed citizens. And here, just to close, here technology is on our side, because the power of ordinary citizens to learn about ideas, to transmit ideas, and to coordinate has increased enormously. So, society by society, in the poorest countries, we need to build a critical mass of people who understand the decision chain, what it takes to harness natural assets. The book describes our own efforts at doing that, which is something called the Natural Resource Charter, which is a website designed to lower the costs of truth to ordinary citizens in these societies. The same process has to be built globally on issues like fish and on issues like carbon. Only through a common understanding of citizens in different countries have we a hope of getting common governance. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Can I just pick up, I'm going to throw this open, obviously I'm sure there are millions of questions, but I want to just hog the floor for a moment. A critical mass of informed citizenry, one could argue that in the run-up to the dreaded Copenhagen summit, there was quite a critical mass of informed citizenry. There were demonstrations and protests and websites and campaign organizations in many, many countries of the world, including some of the most key countries to the negotiations, which then faltered. Somehow there was a disconnect in Copenhagen, and I suggest many other international fora, between an informed citizenry outside and the actual crucible of negotiations inside. I wonder if you would just address that.
Yeah,
since it's such a key part of the whole carbon discussion.
Sure. I think I'd make 2 points. One is that it wasn't a globally informed society. Western citizens got up to speed, but of course, a lot of the big decisions on climate change are going to be in China and India. China, every year for the next 20 years, China will build more power stations than the entire stock of British power stations. Right? So mobilizing British opinion is second order. Right? It's hard to get out of the neo-colonial hang-up and think we still matter enormously for the world. We don't. Right? Power of decision has shifted elsewhere. Right? And so it's building informed opinion in China is much more important than informed opinion here. And what failed to happen was that, right? That the debate on carbon got sidetracked into a crazy debate about who was to blame, instead of looking to think, what is a world that uses carbon sensibly going to look like? make 2 points on that. One is that the argument of China, because you did it, we should be allowed to do it, is a very unethical argument. It's just like fishermen, like the modern fishing industry, saying, because 50, 100 years ago, people could catch fish without restrictions, we should be able to catch fish without restrictions, now we've got these giant hoovers. Right? It's not understanding the basic science, which is that as technology creates scarcity, those scarcity rents are what have to be regulated. And so this fatuous argument that the Chinese government sort of manipulated, that because you did it, we should be able to do it, is just an ethical argument and should have been faced down as that. Second, what would a world look like that was using carbon properly? Well, it'd be one very obvious point. It would not be possible to move a factory that was unviable because of regulations in one country to another country and it be profitable and viable. Right? That is both unethical, unfair, and inefficient. Right? And so that tells us that the incentive regime to reduce carbon has to be pretty well the same everywhere in the world. Now, it doesn't literally have to look the same. Some countries could use a carbon tax, other countries could use quantitative regulations, but the net effect has got to be the same, right? So that's the discussion we should have got into, of what level of incentives, what level of carbon around the world can the world tolerate? What's the incentive structure that will produce that global emissions level? And then let's roll that out society by society, with each society free to choose in detail how it implements it, instead of this ridiculous debate of who's to blame and I want more carbon emissions rights than you. That approach of who should have the emissions rights has no ethical solution, precisely because natural assets and liabilities have no natural owners.
Can I just to follow that up, before we throw this open, just invite you to take this a step further and link it to events today, just up the road in Whitehall. I mean, there will be a new energy and climate change secretary who will go off to all the various UN climate conferences, including Cancun in December. That process is in trouble. I mean, there's no question of that. Perhaps you could just join a few dots for us there. What kind of what kind of advice might you be suggesting for whoever, particularly if Cameron's read the book, what kind of agenda would you like to see them follow?
Yeah, so get out of the blame game, get out of the how many emissions rights should we have, how many emissions rights should you have, and start talking about what emissions can the world as a whole tolerate, what's the common incentive system got to look like that will produce that emissions level. Right? Let me say that one thing our government should also be doing pretty urgently on these global agreements on natural assets, you might have noticed about a week ago, Norway and Russia did a deal in the Arctic. Right? And they were very gleeful that they'd both quite easily come to an agreement, much more easily than the Liberals and the Conservatives, right? And the reason it was very easy for them to reach agreement was, do you know what the agreement was? It was that they'd both plunder the Arctic, right? They'd both extend their borders, as far as I can see, and claim ownership of the natural resources in the Arctic. Right? Now, they're just expropriating something that should belong to us, all, in common. The idea that countries should be free to expand their borders to take in suspected natural assets, that should be stopped. That should be resisted very early. In the next couple of decades, the technology to mine underneath the oceans will be developed. It's really important that we get the ethical principles for ownership of those assets before the technology leads to their plunder. So that should be also high on an agenda.